All right, thank you, everybody. Thanks, Gary, for that introduction. Greetings from cold and rainy southeastern Pennsylvania. I'm sure it's nice and beautiful out there in San Diego. Okay, right into our subject. 1 Kings 6:1 and the date of the Exodus from the Masoretic and Septuagint textual traditions. First, want to note that research article that I wrote is being published in the Near East Archaeological Society Bulletin. It'll be coming out anytime. If you'd like a copy of that, just write to me at the email address on the screen, and I'll put that up for you also at the end. So as a matter of introduction here, the text of 1 Kings 6:1, as we know, is a crucial biblical text lying at the heart of the debate over the Exodus. Those who hold to a 15th century BC Exodus predominantly adopt the reading from the MT in the 480th year. However, the majority of Greek Septuagint manuscripts contain in the 440th year, but a number of others match the MT's readings. This 40-year difference obviously impacts how relevant Egyptian, archaeological, Levantine, historical evidence correlates with the biblical text. In the article and in my summary here, I review and analyze the evidence for the preservation of these two ordinal numbers, the Greek and Hebrew manuscripts, translations derived from both traditions, and external witnesses which document the readings. In the paper, I sketch out the highly complex translational and transmissional history of the Greek text of 1 Kings and how those complexities might impact the decision here on the text critical variant. And the concluding section surveys archaeological and historical evidence very briefly from the late divided kingdom era, directly related to this number, and how it might aid us in adjudicating this chronologically precise textual variant. As you know, the 480th year reading appears in our standard Masoretic Text. It's a picture of the Leningrad Codex on the screen. In 1945, John Weavers did an extensive study on all of the known medieval Hebrew manuscripts and the variants in 1 Kings, and found no variation of this reading. So in the Masoretic tradition, we have strictly 480th as the reading. In many or most, about 24 of the Septuagint manuscripts, it reads 440th, and some of those, about 7, read 480th. We're going to discuss that as we go through our presentation today. So the question is trying to weigh the evidence, obviously, to adjudicate the variant and determine which one. Now, one thing we want to be careful about in terms of doing this is that we don't want to just merely count the number of manuscripts in the Greek tradition containing either variant, but we have to try to weigh them. And unfortunately, this is a very, very complicated task because of the transmissional and translational history of 1 Kings. Now, the literature on this is absolutely massive and complex. I want to give credit to my colleagues Brian Windle and Scott Stripling for sort of bringing this forth in the discussion, but it's taken me over a year to really sort of read through the literature and kind of document it and sort of come down on my own decision on which variant I think is right, but also trying to understand the history correctly. In the Greek tradition, this is known as also third kingdoms or third reigns. Now, what we have in the transmission of 1 Kings is a number of different, what you might call layers or variables that affect what we understand about the text. So first we have the original Greek translation. This is not the Pentateuch in Alexandria, but done later at some point, perhaps in Egypt, perhaps in Israel. Scholars dispute that. What we call the OG, or the original Greek text, is the original translation, or the best that we can get back at it. But we have a number of phenomena that took place over the centuries regarding the text of 1 Kings. The first changes that we had are the so-called Kaige recension, which was an updated translation that took place before the turn of the millennium, and it differs from the OG. It seems to have been based on a Hebrew text that diverged to some degree from the one that seemed to underlie the Old Greek translation. And so that's one element that has to be sort of determined when we're looking at the text of 1 Kings. The second is the three Jewish translators or recensions that took place in the mid to late 2nd century AD. That's Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion. And they had each different approaches to translating the text. We then have another layer of complication, which has caused problems for text critical scholarship for centuries, and that is Origen's hexapla, and then the tetrapla through which it was transmitted in the 3rd century. Adding to that, we have also the Lucianic or Antiochene Greek textual tradition. Now, this is a Greek text of 1 Kings and other books of the Old Testament that were inherited by the church in Syrian Antioch in the 4th century AD approximately. It consists of two main layers. First, it points back to a Hebrew text that originated prior to the turn of the millennium, and then changes that the Antiochene church made to the text regarding style, syntax, harmonizations, and so on. Then on top of that, we have the secondary versions. These are languages that translated directly from the Greek to that secondary language, such as the Old Latin, Armenian, and Ethiopic. I document this material in my paper, but I'm not going to talk much about that in this talk because of time. In addition to all of that complexity that we find in the literature and in the manuscripts, we also have some complexity regarding Codex Vaticanus, which is the oldest manuscript that preserves 1 Kings 6:1, and it preserves the number 440. So that makes it a significant witness to the number. However, whole chapters in this manuscript are in different order of the codex. Sections are included more than once. Some are taken out of first and second Chronicles, and others have no known counterpart in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Greek. And you can see on the right of our screen here, we have an English translation of 1 Kings 6:1. We have 440th here from Vaticanus, but we have various insertions in the text from these other places that have been put in this immediate context. So the methodological question is just simply, was this number impacted in some way? Was it changed when these changes took place, or was it left alone? And in the end, we kind of don't know, but we have to sort of wrestle through these realities when we're looking at whether or not this points to the original text or something else happened to it in its transmissional history. Now, despite all the complexities that I laid out, and like I said, the literature on this is bewildering and highly complicated, we still do have a great deal of data available to us to try to walk through what we think the original text may be. And I'm going to survey some of that right now. So the blessing of doing research in the modern age is that you have access to online manuscripts. So you see on the screen here, Codex Basiliano Vaticanus from the 8th century, which records 440th. We have the Codex Quaeslidianus from the 7th century, also 440th. You'll see in the upper right-hand corner, left-hand corner here, some text here that's really important that I'm going to point to a little bit later. Codex Alexandrinus, and here's an image of Vaticanus. Another interesting witness that we have to the reading of 440th, which is very important, this is the only Old Latin manuscript that preserves 1 Kings 6:1 and the number, and this is called the Quedlinburg Itala. This is from approximately the 5th century AD, but in my view, it points pretty definitively back into probably the 3rd century AD, and most likely represents the original text of the Old Latin in the 440th. Now, the Old Latin, just to reiterate, is not Jerome's. This is taken from the Greek directly. And of course, the reason why Jerome did his translation was to get back to the Hebrew manuscripts that he had access to when he was living in Israel and and of course in working with the rabbis. Now, let's talk a little bit here about Origen. This is very important for us to discuss because as prolific and important as a textual scholar as he was, he introduced for later scholars confusion into the transmission of the history of the text, because these 6 columns that he recorded of the texts that were available to him, including the Hebrew and the different Greek translations, including the Old Greek and the 5th column, in some cases got mixed together in the manuscript tradition. Sometimes they're recorded in margins, sometimes their own transmissional history, but sometimes mixed together. And so this has become a Gordian knot, really of biblical proportions, to sort through. But there are a number of things that are very helpful here as far as figuring out the number. One of the most important ones is that 4/40th appears in what's called the Syro-hexapla. Now, the Syro-hexapla was translated directly from Greek manuscripts, directly from the 5th column of Origen's hexapla. And so this is finely preserved 5th column material that points back to the time of Origen. And in the Syro-hexapla, we have the reading of 4/40th. Now, in my paper, I can't get into all this today. I walk through some of the details with Origen because the question is, what did Origen think the original reading was? Did he think it was 440 or 480? And based on my investigation, there's no evidence to indicate that he made a text critical decision pointing one way or the other. The best I can tell is that he documented that his Old Greek text read 4/40th, but there's no evidence that any of the signs that he created were put next to the 4/40th reading. And so the best we can determine at this point is that he recorded it, but what he thought about its originality, beyond it being the original Old Greek, we simply don't know. So we have some limitation there as far as Origen goes, but very helpful to be that being in the Syro-hexapla. Here's a beautifully preserved manuscript of Hosea 11:1, giving you an example of how this was transmitted in various ways throughout the history of the church and preserved in different places. Beautiful preservation. Even though this is a much later manuscript, you can see all the different columns here that have been passed down through the history of transmission. Now, we know that the 5th column material was often transmitted independent of the other material. So in other words, the material was sort of plucked out of the 5th column and transmitted in independent manuscripts, which is wonderful in terms of pointing back to what was in the hexapla to begin with. And we have manuscripts that go all the way back into the 3rd or 4th century, which is important because that brings us back within a century or so of Origen's life. Now, just as a side note here, I can't get into the details with this. We often say that in the hexapla, Origen placed the signs, the asterisks and the oboli, indicating this is absent from the Greek text or this is absent from the Hebrew and that sort of thing. But there's another school of thought that seems to indicate that the hexapla was actually a depository of raw data, and then the text critical decision was made in a document called the tetrapla, which means fourfold. Now, there's dispute about this in the literature, but it may be the case that the hexapla was just the raw data, and the tetrapla is where the text critical decision making was made. Origen was not able to complete this, and Eusebius and Pamphilus later on worked on it and also included the signs. As we know, the hexapla was a massive work. It was probably never reproduced. Now let's turn our attention a little bit to some of the manuscripts themselves, because we want to kind of get a feel for, well, what's in the Greek tradition? What do we have? I gave you some of the major codices already, and these are very important witnesses. Also pointing back to Origen, back all the way to his time through the Syro-hexapla, but we also have what are called minuscules. These are largely from 1000 AD and later. Most of them read 440th, but this is where we also have deviations in the text. We have a number of manuscripts that read 480th, and these are very important. I'm going to explain those in a moment. The apparatus that you see at the bottom here, it may be Greek to you, and that's because it is. This is from the Cambridge diplomatic edition of First Kings, which ceased publication in 1940. The Göttingen School, or Göttingen, is doing the updated critical edition, but it's not complete yet, and it's because of the complexities that I've outlined. So what I've done in my research is I used Cambridge as a baseline and then tried to confirm the readings as much as I could in any up-to-date academic material. And I was able to find a lot of it, and a lot of it online, to determine how accurate it was. And not surprisingly, highly accurate, with the exception of possibly the old Latin material, which we have much more information on. On the screen here, you see a list of all the minuscules that record the number. The ones that are not bold are 440, and the ones that are in the bold record 480. And I'm going to point to the significance of those in just a few moments. Here's a nice preserved minuscule from the Vatican, 245. As you can see, much harder to read than the capital letter Greek manuscript, so I had to sort of do a side tutorial on how to decipher this so I could find the readings and confirm that they were correct. And I didn't find any errors from the Cambridge edition. Any place that I was able to find an online manuscript, I was able to confirm the Cambridge edition was correct. Now let's talk for a minute here about this Lucianic textual tradition, because this is really important. I mentioned that there are two major components to the Lucianic text. We'll work backwards. First, the Syrian church had in its possession a Greek text that deviated from the Old Greek. We call it the Lucianic text. They made their own updates to it as far as style and grammar, harmonizations of parallel text, and so on. But it's also clear from a number of sources and the academic work that's been done on it that much of the material that was in this text that they inherited can be traced all the way back to the 1st century BC, and particularly to Hebrew texts that differ somewhat from the Proto-Masoretic text. And this is really important for our purposes because we have a number of manuscripts that preserve 480th from the Lucianic tradition. And I'm just going to review those a little bit now. So we have several of them, and they are 19, 108, 82, 127, and 93. And again, these have all been studied very thoroughly. And while traces of changes at the Greek level by the Antiochene church can be deciphered, there's evidence in the literature that many of the differences from the Old Greek go back to a Hebrew exemplar. Now you'll note here a couple of things. One is most of the manuscripts that read 480th are Lucianic manuscripts, but there is one here, letter I, or manuscript 56, which is not Lucianic but has the 480th in it. In my paper, I make the argument that this points to the evidence that this number came from an underlying Greek text that can be traced back to a much earlier time and is independent of the Lucianic tradition. So in my paper, I basically lay out the argument: if one wants to say that the Antiochene church changed all the manuscripts to 480, it can't explain the existence of 480 in 56. And in my paper, I also outline other reasons why they treated the text in a conservative fashion. Now, another thing that I should note here is I misspoke. Manuscript 82 on the left side of your screen, or O, is Lucianic, but it preserves 440th. And so, to me, this points to evidence that the Antiochene church resisted the temptation to change it and conform it to the other Greek manuscripts that were in their possession. They left the number alone. So they had received this text, and this had 4/40 in it. So I think this is a remnant of the Old Greek that is found here in manuscript 82. So sort of independent pieces of data that point us away from the idea that they just wholesale changed the text. We don't see evidence that that's the case, that this text was a received text that they left largely alone. Now here on the screen we have what looks like quite a mess. This is a palimpsest, Codex Z or Z2. This is an Antiochene text studied by a Catholic scholar named Tisserant in 1911, and it reads 480th. This is in the Vatican and available online. That's where I got the scan from. A Syriac chronicle was written over top of this Greek text, but you can decipher it and you can see the 480th underneath. Here's a better view of it. I checked it myself and cross-referenced it with Tisserant's research to make sure that the reading was correct, and it turned out again that the Cambridge edition was right on the money. A couple more sources that we can point to as we work our way through here. So Eusebius, as I mentioned, was involved with the transmission of the tetrapla and or hexapla, but in his chronicle he documents both numbers. So he says in the Hebrew it's 480th, in my old Greek text it's 440th, and but he doesn't give us a text critical answer as to which one he thinks is original. He actually makes an exegetical argument for 480th. So from a text critical standpoint, he doesn't give us anything that we can hang our hat on. He just makes an exegetical argument. Of course, we have Jerome's Latin Vulgate as well, which points to manuscripts that he had access to in Israel that read 480th. I came across some research that seemed to indicate that Jerome purchased some of his own manuscripts, borrowed them from the rabbis. So if this is late 4th century AD, maybe the manuscripts were a few decades old, so that would point us to a reading from a time period that's a bit earlier than that. Now, one of the most significant pieces of evidence that we have to take into account when we're weighing all of this evidence is what I mentioned in the left column of Codex Coeslinianus, and that is readings from Aquila and Symmachus. Now, by and large, the readings that have come down to us from these Jewish recensions are not in their own manuscripts proper. There are examples of that from Cairo, for example, but not for First Kings. But in this particular instance, we have the scribe recording numbers that he had received that were passed down from Aquila and Symmachus translations. Both read 480th. So even though the manuscript itself is from the 7th century, this points us back further in time to a 2nd century AD context. Beautifully preserved for us on the left-hand side of the column, and this again is confirmed in the Cambridge edition, and I was able to document this from the online material. So that was kind of a whirlwind that we went through to cover this, and in 15 or 20 minutes I covered what took me a year to sort of unpack and decipher. But it's important to recognize the wealth of data that we actually have here. It's another one of those examples of the embarrassment of riches that we have of the preservation of the Word of God. It works itself out in complex ways in God's providence, but it is a blessing even though it's difficult to decipher. Now, despite all the complexities that I just laid out, it appears to me that the 440th year reading is early. It is spread across a wide array of manuscripts and other witnesses. And at minimum, we can trace it back to 200 or even 150 AD in the Old Latin text, pointing to a Greek exemplar from that period. It probably, or I'd say maybe most likely in my paper, that this is the original Old Greek reading, possibly originating in the 1st or 2nd century BC. the general consensus is that the Old Greek, or the Greek translations, excuse me, were completed by 160 or 150 BC. So I think the evidence is pretty good that this points back to a very ancient reading as far as the Greek text goes. Now, 480th also comes to us from a widespread textual tradition, but one that overall has more stability to it. As we mentioned, First Kings has a highly complex history of both transmission and translation. I point out in my paper that there were two phenomenon that occurred with scribes. The first is the copying phenomenon. We call that repetition, where a scribe simply sits down and tries to create a photocopy of what's in front of him. But we also had in antiquity what's called resignification. That is the changing of vocabulary, the improvement of syntax, the writing for a contemporary audience. And it looks to me like in First Kings that resignification won out often over repetition, although there's a great deal of repetition that took place. So it's important to understand that that's the case. Now, to summarize the 480th reading, we do have a number of witnesses that seem to point back to a much earlier, not much earlier, to an earlier period contemporaneous with the Old Latin. We have Symmachus and Aquila, which we've already talked about. We also have this data point in the Seder Olam, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. And while the Seder Olam is notorious for its chronological errors, its recording of this data point is clear that it comes from the Proto-Masoretic Text. And then really the independent witness from the MT, separate from the strict Proto-Masoretic Text, is the Lucianic tradition, which points back into the 1st century. So this is going to sound very disappointing after going through all that and after studying this for a year. But when you weigh all of that out, in my judgment, 480th is most likely the original reading. I think the evidence is tilted in that direction based on the general stability of the tradition and the earlier witnesses. But I would not by any means say that it was a text critical slam dunk. And that's, in one sense, I was disappointed that I came to that decision, but I want to try to treat the evidence as fairly as possible. Now, part of the reason why I wanted to do this is so that when we're talking about the date of the Exodus and we're evaluating, when we say things like, well, the Greek or the Septuagint says X, well, there is no single Septuagint. We actually have a very complicated situation here, and we have two aspects of the tradition that preserve the numbers differently. So it's important when we think in precise terms about this, that to say the Septuagint preserves X is not accurate. We have mostly that in the Septuagint, but we have another line of text that recorded the 480. So I asked the question there in your last session. I believe Dr. Stripling and Dr. Evans talked about the where did Jesus encounter this man possessed by the legion of demons? And here you have a case of using external evidence to try to adjudicate a textual variant. Does the text proper only in and of itself, the manuscript, give you the definitive answer? And I think in that case, you found out that, well, we can use some external evidence to figure out what's the original text, what was the original author writing. Well, here I'd like to come at this just with a quick survey of some other research that's been done where I think the scale is tilted in one particular direction. Instead of
10 minutes.
Thank you. Instead of arguing about Egyptian chronology and pottery from the time of the 15th century or 14th century or the Amarna letters and that kind of thing, that's been done a lot. We need to keep doing that. I'm totally on board with continuing to figure that out. I thought we could come at it from the other direction, and that is from the late divided kingdom and synchronizations that we have, where we actually have so much data available to us and material that points us to very precise chronological calculations. So here's what I propose that tilts the scale, and I'm just going to show my hand up front here, tilts the scale, I think, definitively in the favor of 480. We have this interesting phenomenon in the rabbinic literature, and I owe a lot of credit to our friend Roger Young for having done all the hard work on this and giving me some feedback in my paper. But we have two phenomena. We have chronology that is clearly not historical and it's inaccurate. So in the case of the Seder Olam, we have the compressed Persian era down to 53 years or something, 52 years or something like that, and other material that's just clearly not synchronizing with historical or biblical realities. And then we seem to have this other tradition of tracking of jubilees, which seems to be unaffected by those chronological changes or distortions, if you want to call them, or mistakes, however you want to characterize that. We have three of them. We have two pieces of data from the Talmud and one from the Seder Olam. And from the Talmud, we have that the 16th Jubilee began in the 18th year of Josiah. We also have that the 17th Jubilee began at the time of Ezekiel's vision in chapter 40, verse 1. And also that this vision started at the beginning of a Jubilee year in the Talmud material. So can we test this material? I propose in the paper, let's test these statements to see how they synchronize with the different numbers. In the case of Ezekiel 40, we have a text that gives us a particular day in the history of the world. In the 25th year of our exile, the beginning of the year, and the 10th day, in the 14th year after the city was struck down, on that very day. And we have this kind of language actually in the flood narrative as well in Genesis 7:11. On that day, on that very day, this took place. In addition to that, we have the capture of Jehoiakim and the start of the exile in Ezekiel's reckoning on March 16th, 597 BC. So in the biblical text, we've got a day that's nailed down to the precise day, and we have outside the biblical text a day that's nailed down. So if we can converge these numbers together to come up with the proper year for Ezekiel's vision, which appears to me to be 574, and we add the jubilees that are found in the Talmud and the Seder Olam, given Solomon's temple date of 967, we come up with 1406 BC. And of course, there's a lot of other material that justifies the dates that I'm putting on screen. Again, Roger has done all the heavy lifting on this, and I'm just persuaded by the weight of the argumentation and the evidence. So I thought, well, can I use this material to adjudicate this variant? And so you just simply ask the question, did the Israelites correctly record their jubilees accurately and pass it down through the history that the rabbis inherited? And it seems to all converge together. You see on the bottom right of your screen, Josiah's 18th year plus 16 jubilees brings you to 1406. Ezekiel's vision in 40 verse 1 plus 17 jubilees brings you to 1406. The 1366 date, which is the standard date you would get from the 440th, it does not fall on a jubilee. So in order to make it fall on a jubilee, you would have to shift Solomon's building of the temple. And if you do that, of course, you've got a lot of problems that will be introduced into your chronology as a result of that. So anyone who's pursuing that as the original number, I would just encourage that you have to dig pretty deep to sort of make all those shifts work, especially when it comes to these two Jubilee reckonings. And then just the problem of reconciling it with the judges period, which is already difficult with the reading of 480th. So I think that this evidence helps us to adjudicate the variant. The text in and of itself, the variance, I believe 480 is the correct reading, but it again is not a slam dunk. So looking forward to seeing more evidence, perhaps uncovered when the Göttingen version of 1 Kings is published. Last thing I'll mention here, at the end of my paper, I give three and a half reasons to explain the 440th reading. So if 480 is original, you have to explain the 440, and vice versa. If you hold the 440 as original, you got to explain, well, how did the 480 arise? And I provide a number of possible explanations, either at the Hebrew level by accident, a deliberate emendation, or an accidental scribal error very early in the transmission of the Greek, is point number 3 that you see there on the screen. So I know that was kind of a tour de force. I appreciate your time. I don't know if we have time for questions. If you would like a copy of the paper, write to me on the email address on the screen. If you don't catch that, ask Scott or Gary or Brian Wendell or a whole bunch of other people there that have my email. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. We do have time for questions, so let me pass the mic around, and you should be able to hear very clearly. And if you are interested in emailing him, take a picture of the screen and leave your screen up. Okay, Brian, you had your hand up first, so here you go.
Henry, Brian Wendell here. First of all, well done, my friend. That was great. My question for you is this. You had concluded that 440th is likely the original Old Greek reading. Do you think that because the Greek was based on a previous Hebrew translation, and because we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, Hebrew texts that differ from the Masoretic text but seem to align with the Septuagint, do you believe there were Hebrew manuscripts containing this 440th that the Old Greek was based on?
Yeah, I do think that's possible, Brian. Now, if one is arguing that 480 is original, then one would be saying that 440 would be a faulty reading, but in the Hebrew. And that sounds kind of counterintuitive, because it's like, well, it's in the Hebrew, so how is it faulty? But one or the other has to be the correct reading, right? So it could have been a scribal gloss at the Hebrew level, or perhaps a deliberate emendation. And the reason why I say that's possible is because in the divided kingdom chronology, in the Lucianic Greek texts, there are divergences between some of the numbers and the Masoretic. And it's pretty clear that those divergences came from the underlying Hebrew text itself. So it's a pretty complicated situation, but I do think it's possible the 440th could have come from a Hebrew text, yes, but with those caveats. Yeah, so now you could reverse that too, Brian. If you wanted to argue 440, then 480 is clearly in the Hebrew, so one has to explain it. Is it a scribal gloss or is it a deliberate emendation? That would be the two options.
Okay, we have another question.
Yes, Andrew Steinman. There are 3 indications in the Book of Kings of sabbatical years. Jehoshaphat sends people out to read the Torah throughout Judah. The second year of the 2 years of fallow years in Hezekiah's day, and the year that Zedekiah freed the slaves. All these are probably sabbatical years because they meet the sabbatical regulations, and they're all within multiples of 7 years of each other. And again, if you go back, they trace back to 1406. So I don't think you even need to go to rabbinic literature. The Book of Kings itself is coherent with 480, but it's incoherent with 440.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you for that. I was thinking if I ever try to republish this, if the Gunningham edition is done before my lifetime, I would do some updates based on that material and would probably add those arguments to the mix. So thank you for that input.
Okay, we're going to take another question.
Thank you. Thank you for putting all this together. So if it's 480, then it's a round number. So there's a theological purpose to that number. So what's the theological point of 480, and what would be the point of 440? If it's 480, everyone knows that there's some reason for that number, and if someone's going to change it to 440, there needs to be another theological explanation for it.
I don't think I disagree with the statement. It's an ordinal number and it's an inclusive one, so it's 479 years, not 480. So I don't think it's symbolic at all. I don't think an exegesis of the text yields that interpretation. I know that goes all the way back to liberal scholarship of the 19th century German scholarship. So I reject that assumption based on exegesis of the text. But I would add to that that if someone was viewing it that way, they might change the 440. But I don't see any evidence from antiquity that anybody interpreted the text that way. It was interpreted as a chronological referent of 479 years. So that's my view.
Did we have anybody else real quick? Abigail, I'm sorry. We're running out of time. Last question.
Hi, Henry, this is Abigail. Just wondering, do the Dead Sea Scrolls weigh in on this?
No, only not on First Kings, only to the degree that Lucianic readings in Samuel have been found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, confirming the longstanding theory about the Lucianic text going back to a Hebrew exemplar before the turn of the millennium, broadly speaking, but not particularly on this particular reading.
Okay. Henry, thank you. Let's have a round of applause.